So in the previous weeks in this module relating to skills of communication, we've talked about active listening and then the sort of final step of active listening, which is responding appropriately. Throughout those two ways of communicating, those two sets of skills, receptively um, taking what the other is saying and then expressively describing your own thoughts and opinions. Throughout both of those, we should be aiming to maintain a professional stance, which can be understood in lots of different ways, but I'm presenting 5 ideas that I think capture what that might mean in a broad sense. Word choice, assertiveness, negotiation, problem solving, and view deconstructing, which we'll talk about in turn, each one in turn, unpack. So word choice, in general, you might want to think of stylistically oriented ways of choosing words that you might want to avoid in professional settings and ones that you might want to utilize or develop in professional settings. Notice that when I'm describing these things about maintaining a professional stance, that has nothing to do with when you're spending time with friends or family and, cookouts or whatever else. You just, that's not a professional setting, so you behave like you behave. However, some of these things might be useful in personal settings, so you can experiment with some of them. In general, when we are in a professional setting, some things we might want to avoid include jargon or acronyms. As you become more and more familiar with the content or knowledge of your field, it might be increasingly difficult to avoid describing what you know in overly complex language because you're familiar with it. But part of what can help you understand your own content, your own field more deeply, is by practicing deducing the most important principles out of what you know and then describing it in language that is simple and accessible by all or most. So that is reflects a part of what we might want to utilize more of, which is simple language, clearly stated problems, things like that. Other things we might want to avoid will include things like slang or more extreme examples of like patronizing language or insulting language, and certainly not profanity or name calling and sexual innuendos in language. These things might seem more obvious, but they also could be things that you have to pay more attention to in certain settings. In contrast to that, things you might want to use more of include mature language, collaborative language, which really refers to using language that leads the other person to feel less like you're delivering a linear message for them to take, but somewhat more of a give and take, reciprocal kinds of conversation, so that you're not the only one delivering information, you're delivering and receiving information. One more specific thing that I think is really important is to use language that describes observable behavior. So when you're trying to correct behavior or describe behavior to be corrected, using what you see and what you hear and describing it that way, it can be really helpful. Telling a child that they're being disrespectful might make sense to them, but it might make more sense to them to say, hey, look, your voice got really loud when you just talked to me, and you said something that you know isn't okay. You told me no when I asked you to do something in the classroom or something. That's an example of how you might respond to a child that tells them what you heard and how you heard it, so that they know what exactly you meant or mean by disrespect. Okay, so that's word choice. Assertiveness is something that can be difficult to cultivate. Assertiveness is a balance between passivity, when you're walked over, easily manipulated, and aggression, which is when you're walking over or taking advantage of or bullying. So the balance between those two things might be well struck by exercising at least three things that I've put on the PowerPoint here. Self-distancing, which in a nutshell kind of refers to our mindful self-awareness skills we've already covered. So experimenting with the observing self, that's when we feel we're backing out of ourselves and observing ourselves from kind of like a bird's eye view, versus the experiencing self, when we don't do that, when we're rigidly locked in our own perspective. So wiggling away from that rigid perspective to broadening your own perspective of the situation you're in is a type of self-distancing that can be helpful to prepare you for assertiveness in a comfortable way. Something else that can aid in assertiveness development is reminding yourself that you have both the right and the responsibility to aim toward assertiveness. You have the right and the responsibility to look after yourself in a sensitive way that doesn't negatively impact those around you. And this is a balanced effort. So using minimal force necessary means that you use what force in the way you speak or act that is sufficient for you to stand up for yourself, but not overly done so that it ends up negatively impacting others around you. So it just reflects the kind of balance of your own effort in force. The last one is a simple reminder to tell yourself that it's okay. This is a kind of inward stance, reminding yourself that the entire situation has yet to play itself out or yet to unfold. So even if things feel really difficult in a situation in which you're trying to be assertive, even if you feel embarrassed or even if you feel like you're having a difficulty with conflict, you can remind yourself that you're still working through it. So that's not what it's going to look like in the end. Next, negotiation. There's lots of ways to properly negotiate conflict. But there are a few things that I think can be really helpful to remember. And that these things are framed within a pretty well-defined boundary of subject matter and timing. So that what that means is if I'm entering into a negotiation situation with, say, parents of a child I work with, I'm going to be really clear about what we're meeting to discuss. That's the subject matter. And I'm going to be really clear and stick to the timing of the meeting. So if I say, well, let's meet from 3:30 to 4 to discuss this kind of issue, this particular topic. When 4 o'clock comes around, in general, you want to try to maintain consistency with the timing that you put forward, with the timing that you schedule. There can be some flexibility, but you don't want it to spill over into the next day, the next time you meet them, the next email you send them. You want to make sure that it's compact or packaged up in the meeting time that you set aside to discuss the negotiation topic. And a few things that you might want to try out while you're going through the negotiation is a balance of self-awareness and empathy. Empathy could be maybe thought of as compassionate other awareness, because you're kind of putting on their shoes. So basically you're analyzing your feelings in a kind of mindful way, and you're imagining the feelings that they might be going through. You also might want to confer with colleagues or imagine different positions or ask others who might have different opinions than you. That way you get a more well-rounded view of what it is that you're discussing with the person that you're having the negotiation with. And thirdly, you might, after doing those two things, you can brainstorm solutions with the person you're negotiating with, but do so with openness and non-judgment. This reflects the kind of deferring judgment stance of active listening, but housed in the context of negotiation. And in general, you'll want to keep in mind that there are really only 4 outcomes possible outcomes to a negotiation situation. One is that there's resolution. One is that there's no resolution. Okay? And within both of those, the relationship can grow or stay the same, moving in a positive direction or maintaining stability, or the relationship can deteriorate. Okay? So you can walk away in a better relationship with the person than you started, or a damaged portion of the relationship, and you can have a feeling of resolution or no resolution. And there's a kind of gradation of those things, but those in general are the four potential outcomes that may come about. The problem-solving model is a really simple and straightforward way of helping people sift through problems. It's especially helpful when you don't want to take the stance of urging or even giving advice, when you want to stay on the more passive side of responding appropriately, like making suggestions, wondering aloud, things like that. The problem solving is, in a nutshell, asking them what they've tried and what happened when they tried that in relation to the problem, and then asking them what they've thought to try, and ask them what they think would happen if they tried that. And then you've kind of sifted through a couple of options for them to respond to their problem with. And then you can say, well, look, we talked about this possible solution and this possible solution, and others if you mention others. And then ask them, which would you like to try first? Which